you for joining me. This is Peggy Bloomer, and we are going to be looking at the medieval image in the Book of the Hours, especially the interception of the signifier with signification, the historical context, and how these books were commodified. Similar to the beginning of the 20th century, the late Middle Ages experienced a collapse of their societal system, feudalism. These changes created vast class mobility and increased consumerism that foreshadows the Industrial Revolution. In addition, the widespread death of population through the plague caused a collective trauma, similar to the after effects of World War I and II, with a breakdown of trust between the three estates. This paper will examine the images in the Book of the Hours as precursors to modern photographic images, using concepts developed by Benjamin Barthes, Baudrillard, and Lyotard. At a time when few can read, the Book of the Hour often reverses the image-to-text relationship that is described by the postmodern critic. Using online digital resources such as the Harvard Digital Collection, we can actually look at various examples from the book, and we can look at the following: images of commercialization, scenes of domestic medieval life, the inclusion of secular practices and scenes, the inclusion of common symbols like bestiaries and the language of flowers, and any trace of the feudal system within the illuminations. The importance of image in the Middle Ages. Much has been written about the effect of the forces of changing society upon media by the postmodern philosophers, who often declare that due to social and political changes of modern age, the relationship between the signified signifier and its signification has been altered and irrevocably severed. Structuralists, including Claude Lévi-Strauss, often looked at the Middle Ages as a time when there was a radical shift in symbolism that included the religious worldview of Christianity, but they overlooked the profound effects of feudalism on Western political systems that evolved from the time also. In fact, any look at the literary genres of secondary epics and romances of that era suggests that these narratives reflected the effects of Christianity and equally the social order of feudalism. Philosophers, including Hegel and Heidegger, frequently treat the Middle Ages as an unfortunate event, which the modern world has luckily escaped, although the lingering consequences from the feudalistic estates and Christianity are still felt today. This disdain for this time, which lasted centuries and is part of the DNA of Western culture, blinds the postmodern sensibility to the fact that, like today, the image was the predominant form of narrative. In a manner similar to our time, image was the major vehicle for information sharing then as now, albeit the visual media of the medieval times were very different from now and were in large part centered upon religion due to the importance of the church in that society and its control of knowledge. Images in stained glass, churches, and manuscripts, like the Book of the Hours, use these visuals to tell the religious stories to the largely illiterate population. However, even in the 21st century, fascinating glimpses into medieval daily life can be seen within the media of medieval images. Above are two details from the Book of the Hours that are part of the Harvard Digital Collection, which show daily life during that time and reflect the agrarian nature of that society and the feudal system of that time. Secular illustration from romances. The most elaborate illuminated manuscripts were produced by monasteries for royalty and rising merchant class during the late Middle Ages, and the large remaining amount of these manuscripts reflect the fact that these books were hugely popular and had become valued commodities and status symbols. Early illuminated manuscripts tended to focus on the Psalter rather than the Book of the Hours. These earlier manuscripts were Romanesque in style. The later Book of the Hours were Gothic in style. In addition, these Romanesque illuminated manuscripts that predated the early 1400s were much less elaborate and not as commodity-driven as these books became by mid-century. The purpose of these books for the laity was to increase the ability of the non-religious communities to understand and participate actively in prayer in a manner similar to how it is practiced in monastic life. However, with the rise of trade, these books became widely sought out as signs of wealth. Less expensive than Bibles, the Book of the Hours were more obtainable status symbols and were often commissioned and included images of the commissioners and even their family within the illustrations. For example, the Duc de Berry is pictured arriving at the Heavenly Gates in the grandeur book The Hours, and the Duchess of Bedford and her 3 husbands is incorporated into the Bedford Book of the Hours, which reflect the impact that these commissions had upon the execution and subject matter of the miniatures that accompanied religious texts in a way that is similar to the paintings in the Renaissance. In fact, while the Book of the Hours became a popular book for early printers, illuminated Book of the Hours thrived simultaneously. The miniatures in the printed books were reproduced from woodcuts, which obviously could not be altered a lot. To accompany the demand for these books, a sort of monastic assembly line of production employed skilled workers, and division of labor between scribe and illustrators evolved. The evolution of workers allowed for efficient reproduction of these books for wealthier nobility and increasing numbers of rising members of the merchant class. The most dense and grandly illuminated manuscripts were religious in nature, however. As Chaucer's poem to his scribe Adam attests, scribing was a well-established occupation by the late Middle Ages outside of the monastery and away from the oversight of the church. Manuscripts of medieval romances included less accomplished but very interesting images of these stories as well. The illustration of Sir Gawain shown above on the left is rough and not well executed. However, the illustration from Gower's Lover's Confessions incorporates expensive gilding and the use of indigo that we see in many of the Book of the Hours. Clearly, these images tell the story of these romances effectively and prove the popularity of those stories then as now. 2 literary directions for medieval manuscripts. Julia Kristeva, in Revolution in Poetic Language, outlines 4 types of narratives in the way they refer to psychological symptoms and the use of signification within these modes of storytelling. The first type of narrative centers on family and clan is the type of narrative used in the earliest primary epics such as Beowulf and Gilgamesh. It is noteworthy that both the second and the third type of narrative, as Kristeva outlines them, operate simultaneously in the Middle Ages. The second type of narrative that Kristeva distinguishes relates directly to the feudalistic political system, and the third type to the strong religious power of the Middle Ages. Speaking about the second form of narrative, Kristeva says about it that it subsumes family zones, and especially individuals directly, without the intermediary of the clan. The Greek city-state, royalty, and the republic are, each in its own way, hierarchies, structures and dominance, with more or less directly in more or less mediated fashion subordinate human entities. Even when the mediation passes through the family, as in feudalism, the family as social function operates within a totality that dominates and represses it. Its autonomy, a unit of production, is relativized within the state, which has the last, in fact, the only word. The hand-decorated illuminations in the Book of the Hours often included various agrarian occupations, social classes, loyalty to one's lieges, and the relationship within the family was incorporated within the border or on the margins of the text. Visual decorations within the media were of 3 types: miniature, initial caps, and borders. The miniatures could be incorporated with the text or become whole pages, while the borders could surround either text as it did in the calendar sections of the Book or the Hours, or even around the miniatures in the manuscript. In particular, the borders of calendar sections are often filled with smaller agrarian scenes, as they were practiced then during the appropriate seasonal months, and there are glimpses into daily medieval life and relationships between the sexes and feudal social classes, also as well as references to the zodiac signs that refer back to classical symbols. So let's take a look at the third narrative time. Of course, the Book of the Hours was primarily about prayer and meditation at the right time of the year and hour of the day, and this passage of time as a religious history and celebration is at the heart of the structure of the book. The structure of the Book of the Hours was in general composed of the following sections: calendar, gospel sequences, hours of the Virgin, hours of the Cross, hours of the Holy Spirit, penitential psalms, suffrages, litany, prayers, passions, and the office of the dead. The largest illustration of each section highlights various aspects of Christianity, ranging from John the Baptist to the crucifixion of Christ. Even though there are large variations in the choice of these images underscore the closed system of Christianity is at the heart of Kristiva's explanation of the third type of narrative. She says about this narrative that it passes through the ephemeral but specific theses, meaning it constitutes but then is immediately exceeded by what seems outside meaning, materiality, the discontinuity of real objects. The process matrix and enunciation is anaphoric since it designates an elsewhere, the core that generates what signifies. To have access to the process would therefore be to break through any given sign for the subject and reconstitute the heterogeneous space of its formation. This practice, a continuous passing through its limit, which does not close off the significations into a system, but instead assumes the infinity of its process, can only come about when simultaneously it assumes the laws of this process. So then we have to ask, what is this? One thing that the creation of illumined manuscripts in monasteries assured was that the subject of these scenes would ostensibly be about Christian dogma. However, the very personal relationship of the individual illustrator allowed for a large amount of choice in the minor details within larger section openers, marginal decoration, and larger initial caps. In these areas, there is much insertion of other materials that is idiosyncratic in nature and even allows for insertion of local customs and attitude into religious material. John Walsh, Director Emeritus of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, in a free lecture series on myth narrative and historical storytelling in paintings given recently at the Yale Art Gallery, placed upon the screen an early abstract painting and asked the interesting question, what is this in terms of historical content? Clearly, early 20th century abstract art demonstrates the rupture within the tradition of painting that speaks to the outside dissolution of the individual, pitted against the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, and changing social systems. This initial shift as an expression is made possibly largely due to changing social systems. Because of the lack of patronage and the divorce of the fine art painting from commercial interest of society. Of course, as the century evolves and the trauma and the rupture is accepted as an almost mainstream alienation of the individual from the social contract, this type of imagery speaks to more people as it moves into the commercial realm. The pop art movement is not only commercial, but focuses on the way that Walter Benjamin conceptualized the interception of signifier, signification, the historical and mythic with the commodity, by placing the commodity as the subject of the art and at the center of the matrix of the dialectic image. The concept of the dialectic image. Of course, Benjamin spent years and almost 2,000 pages on his famous arcade project, examining the intersection of the image with the social pressures of the 20th century. While the concept of the dialectic image is delineated within the arcade project, it is at best obtuse. The diagram above shows that for Benjamin, the heart of the modern image was his interception with the commodity, with the constructions and deconstructions of historical history, mythic history, historical nature, and mythic nature, bringing these influences to bear upon the image and relating to the fourfold process of trace, allegory, phantasmagoria, and symbol. For Benjamin, examining modern Paris, the image had moved away from what McLuhan labeled cool media like books and illustrations to the newer, harder media of the commercialized image available in the arcades of Paris and other metropolitan cities. It's important to note that the Book of the Hours was a hot media in its day and a very commercial commodity in a society that was evolving and forming around commercial trade cities. In fact, these illuminations in the Book of the Hours demonstrate these four coordinates of trace, allegory, fetish, and symbol remarkably well. Trace in the Book of the Hours. The Book of the Hours contained a lot of material that reflected regional differences, which is expressed in the matter of these books. However, many of these books focus on the historical settings of biblical scenes in Jerusalem. The medieval student and scholar knows just how important the ancient philosophers, writers, and mathematicians were to the establishment of the traditional Christian intellectual life. Even much of the allegorical material, the concept of a physical underworld and heavens and the celestial spheres and the resulting great chain of being, are centered in the traditions of the ancients. Much of the beavery, bestiary, and allegory of this age finds root within the arts and writing of the classical world. The Middle Ages politically and religiously turned away from the rule of the Roman and their technologies to a more tribally divided political system and a more unified religion. But the fleshing out of the Christian imagery and ideologies that is the hallmark of the late Middle Ages is firmly rooted within the traditions of the ancients. While Romance manuscripts do include pagan illustrations, of course that was not appropriate for religious illuminations. Instead, the fossilized history of the ancients and the church is placed within the Holy Land and is often the story of the Gospels of the Old Testament. In addition, the religious and secular life of the Middle Ages is acceptable to the viewer as trace also. We see the trace of how people lived in various medieval regions, how they dressed, how they ate, and even how they produced food and wine throughout these pages. The interaction of their sexes, the relationship between the three estates, how religion occupied the lives of these people is made visible to us on these pages, as are the medieval attitude towards biblical history or other cultures. Allegory in the Book of the Hours. Iconography and allegory at the heart of most narratives of the Book of the Middle Ages, and illuminated manuscripts abound in usage of these traditional visual symbols. As Cassirer in Language and Myth points out, metaphor requires the understanding of each side of the metaphor as equating to the other. There is, he continues, a transformation which removes a certain impression from the realm of the ordinary, the everyday, and the profane, and lifts it to the level of the holy, the sphere of mytho-religious significance. Example of this is shown above in the image of the Apostle Matthew with his symbol, a winged lion that would have commonly been known to everyone at the time. The apostles with their iconography were represented as follows: Matthew the winged man, Mark the lion, Luke the ox, and John the eagle. Even agrarian activity that aligned with displays of the figures of the zodiac is frequently employed within the calendar of the Book of the Hours to illustrate the correspondence of the heavenly activity to the many holy days of the Christian world during the Middle Ages. In addition, the medieval meanings of many animals that can still be found within surviving copies of the bestiaries and the language and meaning of flowers are the basis for the use of many of the choices of many of the animals and flowers that festoon the borders of these books. For example, the peacock traditionally was associated with the resurrection, and the carnation with the crucifixion. Fetishes in the Book of the Hour. Nothing contributed to the breakdown of the religious order of the church and the possibility of social mobility in the late Middle Ages more than the plague. The plague and subsequent changes in the need for a large food supply undermined the rigidity of the feudal system. Massive deaths in all three estates and the behavior of both doctors and clergy towards a diseased population undermined the authority of the nobility in the church. The loss of life even changed the agrarian structure of the feudal system, and a class mobility that was unknown became a real societal force within the time. Trade and commerce had already reemerged and reinforced the strength of cities and economically influenced regions within Europe prior to the outbreak of plague, but shifting patterns of supply and demand escalated the spread of disease. The incubation period of the plague was very rapid, and the cause of its spread was not understood. Therefore, the disease advanced throughout Europe, virtually unchecked, and the concept of death as a character became a common focus within the arts and daily life. Literally, one could see a person healthy in the morning, and he might be dead by supper. One section of the Book of the Hours, The Office of the Dead, revealed the fetishism that is the experience of large-scale death for that time. The trauma of death is revealed within the Book of the Hours, of course. Above is an illustration of monks with pockmarks of the plague. On the left, we see that. In the image on the right, death comes to claim a bedridden person. In the remarkable Tréritures commissioned by the Duc de Berry, Pope Gregory I is depicted imploring heaven to end the plague, while members of the assembled crowd include several dying individuals. Death became an active part of everyday life in these Illuminaires and was often depicted as a presence emerging from the grave or waiting at the sidelines to claim its next victim. Symbols in the Book of the Hour. The Book of the Hours incorporated within the illuminations a lot of symbolism that had become part of the language of the Christian Church. Prior to the age of mechanical reproduction, symbol was a language, a duplication of meaning that would be eroded with the ability to exactly replicate text and image and become a science and part of the Industrial Revolution that would follow. The nature of the symbol was examined by Roland Barthes, who concluded that the most symbolic meaning is intentional and that it is selected from a common lexicon of symbols. Barthes noticed that the use of symbols within a community, similar to the medieval church, has an intentional meaning that is obvious to the recipient of the symbol within that community. This type of use is seen throughout the Book of the Hours. There is, however, a more intentional symbolism that always pervades the Book of the Hours, the active participation of even the most worldly person with a religious life. These books were a medieval how-to book on how to reach heaven through devotion and prayer. The wish image of the symbols of the Book of the Hours is personal redemption and eternal life. It's important to be aware that this use of poetic device can have a dual edge to it. Poetic language and nemesis might appear as an argument complicit with the dogma. We are familiar with religion's use of them, but they may also set in motion what dogma represses. In so doing, they no longer act as instinctual floodgates with the enclosure of the sacred and become instead unfolded by its practices. The signifying process joins the social revolution. And in fact, we see that happens. So the fluctuation society that's revealed within the Book of the Hours in the later part of the medieval ages. This intersection of these components leads to what Barthes called the third meaning or the obtuse meaning. Looking at the directionality in the chart by Susan Buck-Morss, it is clear to see that these books were clearly at the intersection of social and religious forces and acted as commodities that suggest the social movement and changes that were to come within the Reformation and political upheavals. Similar to the cities of Benjamin's Arcade project, the illuminations of the Book of the Hours are filled with images of power, just framed within the metaphor of the church. Then, as in Benjamin's time, city attracted the displaced population. In the late Middle Ages, this was the Hungarian serf who had moved to the city centers, where he was awed by and attracted to the spectacle of commodities expressed through the Gothic church and the offering of numerous and various commodities produced by the expanding guilds. The wide variation in the matter of the Book of the Hours reflected the individual regions and the manuscript illustrations that all underscore the increased importance of individual commercial cities during the late Middle Ages and the rise of both merchants and craftsmen. In a similar fashion to the way modernity believed in human fulfillment and liberation in the industrialized cities through the fulfillment of the individual human through the commodity, Christianity had always been about the hope of life after death through the religious practice. While the church wields its power in the temporal world, the cathedral, the papacy, and the individual priest were concrete symbols of this ideal world in the real world. However, then as now, the world was rapidly changing, and individual life and even the social fabric was facing transformation, and what had been once fixed was breaking down into new systems. So in conclusion, generally the shift to the Gothic style from the Romanesque style is interpreted as an exaltation and celebration of religion and God. However, there are many aspects of Gothic style that are similar to the postmodern creation of cities as destination and the establishment of these destinations as spectacle. I'm referring to what Lyotard talks about in the Postmodern Condition and Report on Knowledge. Times Square and the Shinjuku are set in spaces that reach towards the heaven just as the Gothic Church does. But we see these spectacles as expression of our consumerism and capitalistic systems, not as an expression of godliness. Although the late medieval world still reflected a profound belief in God, these religious centers had also become commercial and trading powers, with a globalization that was no doubt astounding to the typical person of that time. Passion plays and mystery cycles added to the spectacle of the city. Ostensibly, these cycles were all about religious subjects, but these plays were the productions of the guilds and expressed their wealth, power, and individual abilities. By the end of the late Middle Ages, artistic forms had truly changed and demonstrated the dissolution of the feudal and religious forms. We commonly look to literary works like the Divine Comedy and the Canterbury Tales to acknowledge these changes, where a lot of the subject matter mirrored the political and economic changes of that time. The true popularity of the Book of the Hours and its availability to more people incorporated the expansion of ideas, forms, and new sensibility. In fact, the late Middle Ages was becoming so fractured that all narratives, including illustration, fluctuates with an endless rhythm of alternating states in a society of many social orders. This is quoted directly from Christeva, Revolution in Poetic Language. The system of symbol actually transposes in this type of narrative the role symbols to other systems. This implosion of image that is the hallmark of the postmodern condition is actually seen within the later Book of the Hours, where the page is filled with the scene of the miniature with numerous people in attendance. This witnesses to the Gospels do not have the heterogeneity of the postmodern. For example, then exotic and faraway locations still existed, and they were signified through elaborate dress and headgear. In the prayer book of Claude de France, the narrative spreads across facing pages. The layout is almost all image. The text is hardly needed. The expansion of the image to the edge of the page is almost modern in composition. All this points to the fact that throughout history there have been these unique times when imagery in the image reflects the state of the fluctuation of political, religious, and economic forces, that then as now, these trends are reflected within the predominant media of those times. In this way, the image becomes a dialectic statement that reflects the forces of the society of time, revealing what has been and what is becoming. The Hegelian sublation will always be present with the media and art, and be the most palpable in times of extreme change, like the late medieval ages and the postmodern era.